Welcome everybody this morning to our session entitled Justice and Social Identity. Justice and Social Identity. That's an interesting title, so what I thought I would do before we got started today is give you a roadmap of what we're going to talk about in this session. In the first part of the session, we're going to address how social identities matter in the leadership process, and I think this stems from Hoyt's comments at the end. So we're going to talk about social identities. I will start by discussing how social identities matter in large part because they shape expectations. Then we'll turn to Alice, who will discuss how differing social identities that women and men on the average have as leaders can produce somewhat different outcomes when they achieve access to power. In particular, she's going to talk about social justice-related attitudes and values. Sonia will then explore the question of how a critical relational lens on leadership reconceptualizes race and ethnicity in leadership research and theory. Next, the focus of our symposium turns a little bit to more directly understanding how to cultivate social justice-minded citizens, including students and faculty and others, and why that matters. So Dick will talk about service learning in an undergraduate curriculum and its role in helping students become aware of issues and assets of social justice and in shaping their own sense of self. And then finally, Thad Williamson, who will be here shortly, will talk, I promise, we'll talk about 7 virtues of social justice-minded citizens. And he'll also talk about how teaching in the Jepson School and teaching the Justice and Civil Society course has been a catalyst for his engagement in public scholarship. And if there's anybody to look to talk about public scholarship, it's Thad Williamson. And I have to say that Thad recently completed a 100-page plus report for the Mayor's Anti-Poverty Commission, and it's being taken seriously. Here's the headline of a recent paper, local paper, Mayor targets poverty, in large part because of the work Thad and others did on this commission. Anyway, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And so this morning, I'm going to talk a bit about how social categories that either we identify with or others assign us to, how they matter in the leadership process. You know, one example of looking at this is in America, take a look at the top influence-wielding bodies, and there's a clear disproportionate prevalence of white men in top positions. From Congress to Fortune 500s, the chairs of the boards of the Fortune 500s, 94% of those chair positions are occupied by white males. Why does this matter? Why do social identities matter? Representation of women and minorities in public office and leadership positions is a matter of justice and equity, not simply to fulfill these democratic principles of equal opportunity to participate in politics and leadership, but also because members of these marginalized groups can bring to office important perspectives and priorities that may be underrepresented. Many factors contribute to the underrepresentation of marginalized individuals. Theoretical perspectives are vast on this topic, ranging from those focusing on economic disadvantage and then result in limited access to educational, social, cultural opportunities, to those focusing on how members of the dominant group can work to maintain their privileged status, or to focusing on how members of marginalized groups might justify the status quo. The perspective I often take and talk about today is that social identities matter in large part because they shape expectations or stereotypes that people might have of individuals based on social categories. They influence the way we respond to other people, but also they influence us ourselves. So first, social identities influence who we see as fitting, the preconceived notion of a leader, to the extent that leadership is largely, I might argue, in the eye of the beholder, that non-traditional leaders are at a disadvantage. One social category that's received quite a bit of attention, actually from a lot of people in this room, including Dawn and Susan and Lynn, myself, of course, Alice and Sonia, is gender. And a very influential perspective to this is that many of us take, including myself, is looking through Alice's work on role congruity theory. And this perspective contends that when people perceive leaders, they combine both leader and gender role expectations. And the expectations we have that are the qualities that are deemed necessary for leaders are more consistent with our expectations of that are associated with the male gender role as opposed to the female gender role. There's been quite a bit of research in, using this perspective, and there's substantial empirical support that these kind of incongruities between roles do contribute to women being evaluated less favorably, less likely to get leadership, more difficulty to attain leadership positions, being viewed as less effective in these positions. In addition, these women seem to engender hostility for violating the traditional female gender role. One classic example of this backlash, we might call it, comes when, let's say, 2008 in the airports, when you're walking around and everywhere you turn there's a Hillary Clinton nutcracker in the windows. You turn on the news and listen to Tucker Carlson's comment as when he heard about the nutcracker for Hillary Clinton. He says, "As I've often said, when she comes on television, I involuntarily cross my legs." So there's the backlash that women face. But in addition to having a masculinity standard, we also have a white standard in leadership. That is, being white's been shown to be a central component of our conception of the leader prototype in America. And so in short, race and ethnicity certainly matter in leadership. For example, unlike their white counterparts, successful black leaders possess disarming mechanisms that perhaps attenuate stereotypical perceptions of threat. For example, in recent research dubbed the teddy bear effect, black CEOs are significantly more baby-faced than white CEOs. They're also judged as being warmer than white CEOs. The research examining ethnicity and race is much less abundant than the work on gender, and research examining other social identities that are marginalized, such as sexual orientation-related identities, is even less prevalent. Importantly, many researchers have examined these identities in isolation. And in reality, of course, have many various identities that interrelate. They're not independent. And we're really just starting to take the importance of this seriously and looking at intersecting identities. And in doing so, we can discover new things that may counter our established wisdom. So for example, recent research has shown that the backlash that female leaders receive when expressing dominance, that's moderated by race. So that is, white women experience this backlash. Black women do not seem to experience the backlash. Additionally, white men don't experience backlash for expressing dominance. Black men do. And these are relatively new findings looking at the intersection of race and basically going beyond looking at gender being white men and white women. Other research has shown that multiple identities are important when you're looking at failing organizations. So for example, leadership at the top of failing organizations, white men seem to get some of a pass if they're shown to be at the helm of a failing organization. Black men and white women are evaluated more negatively when they're at the helm of a lead organization compared to white men. And the group that's evaluated the most negatively, black women. And these researchers who do this research suggest that there's a double jeopardy that black women are experiencing, the negativity associated with both of their subordinated identities. In sum, my point here is that this research substantiates the call for social scientists to look to incorporate these ideas of intersectionality into our methods and our theories. Next, what I've talked about so far is how expectancies associated with social categories influence how we perceive others, but they also influence us ourselves. You know, we're all very aware of the stereotypes that surround our identities, and they can impact the way we think, the way we behave. If we have stereotype-based expectations of inferiority, they can place a really large psychological burden on individuals. So researchers have shown that leaders who are threatened by the risk of confirming negative identity, your group that you belong to is typically not good in leadership, then that can produce a stereotype threat in situations where people, when they think they're going to be evaluated through this negative lens, they can perform less well, be less likely to want to take on leadership roles. And my colleagues and I have shown that this is particularly likely to be the case when people experience stereotype threat from multiple sources. And Susan Murphy worked with me on that research. However, being aware of negative stereotypes and being put in a situation to potentially confirm stereotypes doesn't always result in detrimental responses. Sometimes people actually react to the stereotype, and I've done some research a number of years ago now looking into this. And for example, we can look around and see leaders who show a reactance response. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, she grew up in Birmingham, Alabama during racial segregation and was fully aware of racial hostility her success as a leader depended on how she responded to knowing that how how she responded to the racism that was around her. And she says, you know, my parents had me absolutely convinced that, well, you may not be able to have a hamburger at Woolworth's, but you can be president of the United States. And I, in my research, was pretty interested, what are some factors that help people respond positively? And one factor that I've shown is a high self-efficacy or confidence in leadership. Women who are highly confident actually respond in a very positive way if we, you know, kind of confront them with a negative stereotype. They perform better, they're more identified with leadership. So in sum, social identities matter in the leadership process. They matter how we respond to other people, and they matter in how we respond ourselves. And I'd like to end my brief remarks today on a hopeful note. And contrary to an opening sentence of an empirical article I just finished reviewing, the picture is not completely bleak for women and minorities. That was literally the opening sentence. It's so bleak for, it's not, I don't think. But there are increasing numbers of individuals from marginalized groups taking on very important leadership roles. You can look at our recent election, and right now we have the most diverse Congress in history. We have a record number of women and Latinos in Congress, first openly gay individual in the Senate, first Asian American woman in the Senate, could go on. And the mere presence of more women and minorities in top positions will begin to break down the negative stereotypes against these leaders. And we also know the findings in the social sciences are clear that once followers have a chance to get to know individuals and evaluate them based on their leadership relevant performance, then these expectations and judgments based on social categories become less prevalent. So, thank you.
Well, I'm a social psychologist too. We're very well represented today. But I'm going to make a confession that I've never made publicly before. And that is that I've always found social psychology a bit narrow. And it's because I'm really not prototypical in my education. And my education was too broad. I did social relations at Harvard Radcliffe way back, and it was all social science. And then I went to the University of Michigan in the old days that had a joint program. We were seriously educated in sociology and psychology. So then I started my career in a psychology department, and oh my God, it was social cognition. It was all experiments. And so I did it. But I always was discontent with it. I studied attitudes mainly, which I regard as the broadest area of social psychology, and so I was pretty happy with my attitudes and persuasion and attribution or whatever. But then the women's movement came along, and I thought, wow, all those questions. We have no answers as social psychologists or as any social scientist, and what an opportunity. So I marched in to studying gender. And then there was another wonderful discovery. I discovered meta-analysis. It was sort of, I got pushed into it in a funny way, I don't have time to explain. But I was an early adopter. And this was a way to be grand. You can take all that research that other people have done and you can do wonderful things with it. So it seemed in studying gender, of course. There was a lot of research out there because most studies had men and women, whatever. But I just needed to collect it together and I could make a contribution. So I did that. I started out not with leadership. I started out with aggression and social behavior and social influence related to gender. I did meta-analyses, among other things. But then I thought, leadership, what a rich area of social psychologist, of gender. It's all there. It's all there in leadership because you have, individual differences and identity, and you have prejudice and stereotyping. It's all wrapped up in leadership. And so I thought, I've got to do leadership and gender. Then I did something that worked, but it was kind of foolish when I think back on it. I made a grant proposal to NSF, and I actually got money. And I said I was going to do 4 meta-analyses, grand things: gender and leadership style, gender and effectiveness of leadership, gender and emergence, and gender and discrimination and prejudice. And so I ended up with like 4 years of grant, but it took about 12 years before I got all the papers out. Because I was sort of still naive about meta-analysis, how long it took to produce some of these. So that's fine. I discovered a number of things. I can't really summarize them here. But, you know, one of the things that's particularly interesting is leadership style and whether there are any differences. And, you know, I thought that was consequential, and it may be. And what did we find? We found, you know, the obvious, that women are more participative, more democratic than men. And then later I studied transformational leadership, and I found, as I had hoped, that women are somewhat more transformational, particularly on the individualized consideration. Not less transactional, actually more transactional on contingent reward, the use of reward. Men tended to move more toward the negative approach. And so I thought this was important. Even John has confirmed that, you know, and actually the McKinsey organization took it up and they confirmed it. And so I think, well, that's good, isn't it? So there's a sense in which women are better leaders then, because this has identified good leadership in many ways by social science. But then you look at the size of the differences, and they're not very large. And then people don't necessarily receive transformational leadership well when it comes from a woman, right? And so it's more complex. And so then I got the idea that's still something that I'm trying to develop, that maybe I should return to my heritage in studying attitudes and look at attitudinal differences between men and women. So I did a study, very simple sort of study really, took the social survey, looked at the items that produced sex differences, and the first factor is social compassion. And so women, in terms of social policy, they're more interested in doing things for poor people, for children, for families, education, healthcare, you name it, it's the public good. And also, people who study values have found related sort of things. Shalom Schwartz, who does those huge studies of values around the world, he identified the two areas where women sort of, you know, cross-nationally differ from men. They are benevolence and universalism. So benevolence is caring about and giving to the people with whom you associate. Universalism is extending it to other groups. Yes, we can care about other groups and other people as well. And so I've become convinced that women are more benevolent, universalistic, and compassionate than men are. Might have something to do with the kinds of leadership that take place when women do have power. Now, we don't have enough power now, but when women do have power. And so I've been looking out at the literature with that lens, and you can see in the work by political scientists, they've studied women in legislatures a lot, and that theme follows through, and it's cross-national, it's cross-party, it's not huge, no. But women tend to advocate, again, for the public good, for education, for health care, more than men do, care about poor people, care about minorities, etc. Do these policies get through? Not necessarily, of course. It would depend on the broader context of the legislature, usually being held on the left by the Democrats, the policies might get through. Work by Laurie Beeman and her colleagues on India that's so interesting. You know, they randomly assigned municipalities to have women village leaders. And so it was a natural experiment. What did the women more than the men? They brought things like water to the groups. They did things for the community, and they were less corrupt. And these are very good measures of these two tendencies. Now, the economists are invading the study of gendered leadership. And they do very sophisticated, really, regression studies. And so there are a bunch of quite new findings that are looking at corporate and business contexts and what's related to having more women on boards and more women executives. So they found out that on the corporate boards of the Fortune 500, the proportion of women board members, controlling for many other things, predicts companies' philanthropy and charitable giving, so giving to the community. Also, a similar study, a very broad sample of American corporations, more women on corporate boards predicts more corporate social responsibility. Those are, you know, independent measures of corporations, particularly on refraining from engaging in negative, unethical business practices. interesting work by a Kellogg colleague at Northwestern on the Norwegian experiment, you know, the 40% quotas for women on all the boards, which, you know, they're all there, at least 40%. And actually profits fell. It's not widely known, but profits were lower compared to the controls. They're very sophisticated controls. But there was a reason for it that's very apparent in the data, and that is that there were fewer layoffs with the economic downturn with the women on the boards. And David Matza and Miller it is, they've confirmed that finding in a large sample of American businesses, a very big sample. And they've shown that businesses that have women owners as opposed to male owners have fewer layoffs in the financial downturn. So they interpret that with no direct measures, but they interpret that, the economists, in terms of women's greater concern with the welfare of the employees. In other words, having a, giving more weight to the social good and considering a wider range of stakeholders with not such a narrow focus on profit per se. So it's a similar kind of pattern that you see in the political leadership findings. And then there's Steven Pinker. I don't know if any of you read his latest book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. You may not believe that violence has declined, but he makes a really good case for it. That over the centuries, there's a huge worldwide decline in violence. And he provides an interesting analysis of it. And he's announced there's several causes, but one of the causes is the ascendance of women. And so his is a historical analysis. It is not accompanied by quantification or, regressions or whatever, but he does make a good case for it when women rise into power, that there is a decline in violence. So I would like to suggest to you that, yes, women leaders are different. There are some small differences in leadership style, which actually make women look rather good. In that they do tend to epitomize slightly more than men what we've decided is effective leadership style, but that may not be the most important thing about women as leaders. It may be that women have somewhat different goals than men, and that those indeed are acted out. In a broad sense, attitudes do predict behavior. And we do find women proceeding differently, both in political leadership and in business leadership. And it is in favor of the public good. You may or may not think that's a great thing, with less emphasis on profit, etc. I personally think it's a great thing, and that our world would be quite different if at the highest places were held at least 50% by women.
My remarks about how a critical relational lens on leadership actualizes race, ethnicity in leadership research and theory has 4 mini chapters. Chapter 1, my standpoint. Located within a School of Public Service by choice and as faculty director of a research center, I am interested first and foremost in leadership as a means to help address social problems, more specifically those associated with addiction and social inequality. As a sociologist, I link the micro context of individual experience with the macro context of individual and structural forces influencing that experience. I locate my work within a relational leadership paradigm. While I appreciate the contributions of leader or follower-centered approaches to leadership, I believe that focusing on the collective dimensions and the constructed dimensions of leadership offer new insights worth pursuing. In a recent book with Mary Yu Bean, we put benefits of engaging these two perspectives in interplay, and I think actually this symposium reflects that perspective, that approach. Interested in organization and management theories, I also see the value of bringing critical theory to complicate our understandings of leadership. Then, in exploring the collective dimensions of leadership, and in doing so, I introduce the notion of embedded agency. Of course, if we talk about leadership, we must talk about agency. but agency is situated in physical and cultural contexts, embodied around social identities that have corporal expressions and social consequences, grounded in relations of power, and located in geographic and structural realities that define both constraints and opportunities for action. Chapter 2, my interest in the relationship race, ethnicity, and leadership. My identity as a leadership scholar developed mid-career when about 4 years ago, I participated in a large research program to study leadership in grassroots social change organizations. We worked for 7 years with 150 leaders of 92 organizations committed to empowering marginalized communities in the United States. We used an interpretive, multimodal research design to understand how leadership happens in these organizations and also to theorize about the nature of leadership. We asked, in what ways do communities doing social change engage in the work of leadership? We did not ask leadership questions to our partners. Instead, we asked them about what they were trying to do with their organizations. We found 3 mechanisms or ways by which individual efforts were transformed into collective achievements through leadership work. We clustered many of these leadership practices into 3 categories intended to reframe discourse, those intended to bridge difference, and those intended to unleash human energies. Together, the leadership work done through these practices helped these organizations leverage the power to influence powerful others in society to achieve their goals. Yes, leaders prompted these practices, but it was in their enactment by all stakeholders that we actually saw the work of leadership. During this work, we saw race ethnicity emerge as one of several important issues, so we started to pursue it. For example, in unpacking this idea of reframing discourse, we noticed that communities were encouraged to identify with the marginalized cultural identities from which they had distanced. We document this in our Leadership Quarterly paper, Sense-Giving and the Role of Cognitive Shifts in the Work of Leadership, by Foldy, Goldman, and Ospina. So we went back to the raw data to identify explicit mentions of race, ethnicity, to explore how it was and used to develop collective capacity. We found that some organizations interweaved narratives of multiple racial groups into their discourses change. Others instead strongly encouraged people to find strength in their cultural traditions. And yet others encouraged people to understand the self by reflecting on their racialized lived experience. These practices were in turn linked to capacity outcomes like building a sphere of interdependence to bridge differences and reframing a sense of self in relation to others that produced personal transformation. We document these in the Ospina and Su paper, Weaving Color Line in the journal Leadership. Chapter 3, how do these insights fit in the literature? In our Foldy and Ospina paper, a critical review of race and ethnicity in the leadership literature in Leadership Quarterly, we locate our work on race and leadership in one of 3 different categories. Our work is located in the smallest category of articles that we found, and it's a group of scholars who study how do leaders grapple with the social reality of race, ethnicity, and it really represents the smallest category in our sample. The other 2 categories, which are larger and very, very rich and interesting, where most studies fit, saw race, ethnicity as an independent variable. One group of scholars have studied how race and ethnicity influences the perceptions and evaluations of leaders, and there's lots of scholars here who do that, precisely that kind of work. And the other group of scholars has studied how race and ethnicity influences enactments of leadership, so issues like leadership style, etc. So those 3 categories represent the world within which race and ethnicity has been connected to leadership. But we also saw 3 other critical elements that are worth reviewing here. The first one is we saw in the literature a discontinuity in the progressive interests of this relationship. Lots of interest about it in the 70s in mainstream leadership, mostly around the second 2 categories that I described. And then these research plateaus. You don't see a lot of more coming up in the mainstream leadership. At the same time, lots of work in education, communications, Black studies, and management domains outside of leadership started to mushroom around this relationship. Nevertheless, the insights of the latter category of research remained marginal in the leadership literature and was either ignored or dismissed. Scholars in two different leadership studies on the one hand, race theory on the other hand. And both seem to be moving separately from an entity to a relational perspective in the research that they were doing. So a small group of scholars used both lenses to put them together to study leadership, mostly outside of the mainstream leadership. And finally, we noticed a reluctance in the scientific literature to incorporate insights about research done on leaders of color into the broader theories of leadership. We're colorblind, which really means that the standard social identity referent and a Western perspective. The racialized nature of whiteness is ignored, treated as neutral. Another way of saying this is that the research on whites is generalizable, but research on people of color is taken as an instance from which it is hard to generalize. Or a sociological interpretation of saying this is that people of color are seldom taken as paradigmatic human beings to draw from for generalizations of the human experience, and in our case, for generalizations about the universal experience of leadership. Chapter 4, Conclusions. To finish, I draw a point from critical race theory. In a chapter on race in Dick Couto's Handbook of Political Leadership, Tommy Curry argues that there is a need to bring into our inquiry of American social life what he calls a necessary knowledge. His thesis starts from the assertion that we will not have correct knowledge of the world as it actually exists unless we bring in a race lens. Doing so, he argues, means looking at two synergistic but separate of defining US social life. First, the extent to which whites still maintain and exhibit racist ideas, which is something that we see in the literature. That's basically how much progress has happened since desegregation. Second, the structural dynamics of US racism, so the less visible, institutionalized, or systemic forms of racism. Curry argues that this knowledge is absolutely necessary to properly understand the socio-political of American society. Quote, to ignore the centrality of race in American society, he argues, can only teach students to ignore racial inequality and become indifferent to the realities of oppression rather than being indignant of them. It is a responsibility of liberal education, he argues, to avoid this possibility. I would add that this job can be not left exclusively as a burden to the faculty of color in the universities. From what I've seen at Jepson, the school is doing a relatively good job at bringing this type of liberal education that broadens people's minds, in part, I think, because of the multidisciplinary nature of the project. But this is not the case in the training of scholars from the leadership field as such, where critical race theory and issues of the philosophy of science are not taught. And this, to me, is a problem in the field. My argument, just one, is not that leadership scholars must be taught to denounce the recurring patterns of social inequality or to become activists, but if we take seriously the assumptions that leadership is a relational phenomenon, that context matters more than just a simple background, that agency is embedded in social reality, then the necessary knowledge thesis cannot be ignored. Empirical studies on leadership and the theorizing of leadership cannot be colorblind. At a minimum, we must be willing to ask, how do the people we're studying define their identity, what from outside forces define it, and how aware they are of this. This makes research much harder, but the results more rewarding in helping us better understand the reality of leadership.
Brothers and sisters, it gets us past comrades, leaders, followers, speaker, audience. I have to admit a bit of the syndrome going through me, because after hearing all of these wonderful young established scholars so articulate in their views, the recurring thought is that I have is, what the hell am I doing here? But nonetheless, I'm going to do my very best to both present my own ideas and try to integrate some of the ideas that I heard. And so I really look forward to what I have to say. Years ago, we weren't in a setting like this at all. We were in a windowless room in Richmond Hall, I believe, for 3-hour meetings twice a day to develop a curriculum. And we had a few North Stars. We knew that the curriculum had to be for and about leadership. We knew it was going to be multidisciplinary. There was a call for experiential. John Gardner encouraged us to create a collaborative and not a competitive curriculum. All over the nation, he wrote to us, classroom instructors are trying to teach young men and women how to lead by lecturing at them. You couldn't use that means to teach a ballerina to dance, and it's just as limited in teaching a young person to lead. We have to invent many patterns of link and practice, classroom and field experience. And one of the things that attracted me to the Jepson position was the promise of linking experiential education to the curriculum. I had been at Vanderbilt University for about 13 years, leading student community programs. This program grew out of the student protests of the 1960s, when administrators realized that student protests could be disruptive on campus. So they decided to give students money to go off campus and raise hell. And so this program was the legacy of that. And over the course of about 2 decades, we helped establish 23 community health centers in Appalachia and other parts of the rural South. We started a statewide program on occupational safety and health. Started farmers markets where small growers could sell directly to urban residents. So I had a sense of the power of what community partnerships could do, involving students and community leaders. And so I was a very strong advocate of service learning within the curriculum, now called Justice and Society. I don't know if the format is the same, but we 30 hours of service. And I was a stickler that that service be face-to-face, not going in and doing computer programming for a nonprofit, but doing face-to-face service with somebody. And many of you have teed this up very well for me, because we talked about in-group, out-group, we talked about prototypes, stereotypes, we talked about leadership as relationship. But I felt that, and we all agreed, that service learning was a very powerful tool in personal development, without which there's no leadership development. And so I felt that this was a necessary and sufficient, but not sufficient condition for establishing leadership. And I remember in the first semester when we were doing this, Joanne came back and she said, this stuff really works. And it can be, I'll get to that later. The other thing that we had going for us as a leadership school was that we were dealing with a population that was probably the least prepared for leadership development. They are undergraduates, young adults, and many of you have referred to the problem of values, articulation, etc. And Jim Burns writes in Leadership that in a traditional society where roles are very well defined and development is linear, there is less opportunity for developing multiple roles with the diverse groups that is an essential to leadership. So he, And he mentions that the affluent, let me get this right, the adolescence in a child-centered affluent suburban community represents some of the child rearing in a very traditional society with very linear role taking. And that's who we were working with. And he argued that it is difficult for these students to develop empathy without experiencing members of other groups. So this is one of the purposes of service learning. Let me turn now to a recount of some of the students' journal entries and experiences from service learning. And this is in terms of our hope for values development. Every community-based educator will recognize the practice of Burns's theory, that is adolescent development. A student returns from tutoring a child in an inner-city elementary school. In getting acquainted, he learns that a student's uncle died the week before, shot to death. The role of tutor in a group, very different from the classmates in his elementary school, has introduced him to a parallel, quote, parallel universe in which people die from gunshots. Or the two students who served as sight guards for the blind at the state fair and commented how their blind partners would judge the thrill of ride by the screams they could hear. Without screams, they had no interest in the ride, but enjoyed the rounder precisely because the screams it evoked. The students also noticed the stares, laughter, pity, and avoidance they drew those with sight as they walked arm in arm with persons without sight. The fold of a blind person's arm allowed them to see clearly that the visually impaired laugh as hard, smile just as much, and enjoy life with the same amount of intensity. Or the student working with special populations at the Y swimming pool and was very nervous about it. Meeting Anne, I extended my hand. There was a possibility that she may neither understand the concept of shaking hands nor that I was trying to establish some sort of connection between the two of us. Luckily, I was not left standing there in the middle of an awkward silence. Anne took my hand and smiled, returning my gesture of friendship, and became my teacher. And that is some of the things we've been talking about before, beyond an us-them group identity to a me and you subset within that us and them. There are other examples I would go into, but as I was preparing these remarks, I thought, you know, I run into so many alumni who speak in class about their service learning or their internship. So I started making a bet with myself that if you go up to any of the alumni tonight and ask, where'd you do your service learning? They'll tell you just like that. So just to make the bet a little bit safer, I called one of the Jepson students with whom I'm in recent contact. She's trying to write a book. And I asked her, where'd you do your service learning? And she had trouble sorting her service learning from her internship. And then she said, oh, that was the mentoring program. She had started a mentoring program, but I required her to mentor a child in that program for her service learning, not just run the mentoring program. And so she said, oh, yeah. Is that the one I did with Lucretia? She knew the child's name more than 10 years after the event. And I asked her, what did we read in that course? She said, I have no idea.
Hello, thanks for coming. I guess on the last one you have to listen to, so it's almost over. You'll make it. I'm sorry I'm late, but actually the reason I'm late has everything to do with the theme I want to talk about, which is coaching basketball team of 8, 9, 10-year-olds from a low-income neighborhood in Richmond, and it was the first game of the season, so I had to be there. The game went to overtime. And so tonight, when you have your cocktails, lift an extra toast to Messiah, our kid, who hit 2 free throws with 2 seconds left, and we won. So I came to Jepson School. I had brought with me 2 research tracks, one in urban politics and policy, and second, a normative political theory track with particular interest in questions of justice relating to capitalism. And these themes came together in my book on sprawl, justice, and citizenship in 2010. Currently, those tracks are more or less separate again. I'm working on, from the political theory point of view, trying to resuscitate John Rawls's idea of a property-owning democracy as an alternative from a liberal egalitarian point of view to the welfare state, and also looking at related questions of global justice. And on the urban politics, and I'm working on a comprehensive study of Richmond politics in the last quarter century, which is something I've never attempted before, a community study. But what I want to do mainly today is talk about the diversion of justice in civil society and how it's evolved since we inherited it from Dick, and I'm very grateful for the work he's done, and Nancy Stutz as well, and Doug Hicks, a former Jepson faculty member who really developed this course that I've been very privileged to inherit. It is a community-based learning class. It's still 30 hours face-to-face. Since I've been teaching, it's always also had a strong political philosophy component, and also has a significant empirical and historical component, typically investigating in depth the roots and causes of one or two of the problems and issues they're seeing in their communities. So this past semester, for instance, we read, and Charlotte was there, I don't know if you read all the Plato's Republic, but you were supposed to, and it's about 2/3 of Rawls, The Theory of Justice, and Iris Marion Young's book, Justice and Politics of Difference, and I'm hopeful that 10 years from now, Charlotte will remember at least one of them, but we'll see. But I asked, why do we spend so much time on Plato? And there are several reasons, but one is really most important for what I want to talk about. Plato offers some lasting value even to democratic egalitarians. This is not just about principles and concepts. It's also about the character and the soul of the people who adjudicate and implement justice. And to me, that thought has resonance even today, because realizing justice is not simply about having the most persuasive or refined arguments. It's about human beings being sufficiently motivated to do what it takes to advance a conception of justice in the real world. So with that in mind, I want to briefly give you a rundown of a list I recently came up with, frankly, because I wanted to make class last semester end on a rim shot. And also, I have to do some public to make good material. And these I'm calling the 7 cardinal virtues of practicing social justice. And these are not quite the inverse of the 7 deadly traits Barbara Kellerman wrote about, which, to remind you, were incompetent, rigid, intemperate, callous, corrupt, insular, and evil leaders. But I want to cite that to show that what I'm doing is not unprecedented, even among serious. Okay. This is not just an airport book. Okay. First of all, awareness. Awareness that the world is not a fair place and that many people suffer and live constrained because of profound historical answers. So how do we promote that in the course? Well, it's pretty simple. We put them in the field. And we also go on historical tours and site tours. You will think about the world differently if you've done a tour of the city jail. Second, sympathy. This is, in the Smithian sense, understood as a cognitive ability to put one's self in the position of others. But third, and this is where things get more challenging, this is critical consciousness. So, encouraging awareness of and sympathy for the downtrodden, those things are not really controversial for most people. But investigating the historical and political reasons why people are downtrodden is always much more controversial enterprise. But we have to teach our students to go there. And finally, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are 2 pairings of related virtues that are sort of in tension with one another. The fourth one being anger. That is the capacity to feel anger at injustice, what Robert Solomon called a passion for justice related idea. Without that anger, nothing ever gets done. But the flip side of that is hope and imagination, with the belief that things can be different, that change is possible, and the effort is not futile. 6 and 7, courage, willingness to stick in doing so will not earn you applause. And then the flip side of that being humility, recognition that one does not have all the answers and that all our actions will have some unintended consequences. Now, we can make another issues having to do with the mechanics of social change, but I'll say that for another time. Right now, I want to share with you one of the epiphanies I've had in Richmond, and there have been a couple of profound ones, but this one is the most relevant for today. So my very first semester teaching this course, Justice and Civil Society, in the fall of 2005, I had an outstanding group of students, some of whom have gone on to pursue justice-oriented work as a vocation in education, nursing, and ministry, for instance. And then there was Biz. Okay. Biz was a good student, but she drove me and a lot of other people crazy with her tendency to say what was on her mind, whenever it was on her mind. And you can keep the tape rolling. I wouldn't be embarrassed to say about Biz. But I owe a great debt to her because right in that first semester, she was the only student to have the temerity to ask me directly, so what are you doing about all these problems of poverty and inequality? And she said it in such a way that I could not adequately respond by saying, well, I'm working on a book so I can get tenure and maybe somebody will read it. But of course, that is in fact what I did for the most part my first few years here. But I did not forget Biz's question. But more or less over the hump, I began getting deeply immersed in the city of Richmond, both at the level of personal engagement, the coaching I mentioned as an advocate for public housing residents, working with a homeless soccer team and a couple other things, and also at the level of public policy and public scholarship through commentaries on local politics and the media on a regular basis, and as the author of the city's anti-poverty report that was released last week that's being advanced by the mayor. And I'm on sabbatical this semester. I'm located at UR downtown, which is too ball, and one of the things I'm doing while working on this book on Richmond is to suddenly become a participatory research project because I'm working with the mayor staff and moving these recommendations into implementation over the next year. And so for someone who set to do a community study of political leadership in Richmond, knowing really not a whole lot, to suddenly be in a position to have a voice in City Hall is, for want of a better word, really cool. But I'm convinced the experience, however long it lasts, I mean, eventually they may kick me out, is going to make me a much better scholar of both urban politics and of leadership. Some respects in which public scholarship is easier than writing for journals, and others in which it is much more challenging. For instance, people will actually read what you stuff, and they'll scrutinize it. But I'm convinced that doing public scholarship of this kind gives me a much better answer to Biz's question, and that to be a credible teacher of social justice in a leadership studies setting, at some point you need that experience in the ring of trying to advance social justice in practice wherever you can. Further, I think that public scholarship is, to take up one of Michael Genovese's questions from yesterday. I want to connecting back to the questions of identity raised earlier on the panel. I think an honest look around the room shows that leadership studies discussion has a long way to go in terms of engaging and being relevant to communities and scholars of color in particular. And this is unfortunate, but also an opportunity. Just as it takes willful obstinance not to recognize that systems of racial oppression are at the core of the story of American democracy, does not vanish with the 13th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, or Barack Obama. It also requires a little more than a glance at demographic projections to understand that questions of race and difference are going to continue to play a central role in American life in the 21st century. Questions of ethical and effective leadership and complex dilemmas about how to advance worthy ends when one is not in a position of privilege are often felt particularly urgently in low-income communities. For instance, one thing I'm wrestling with now, how in a city like Richmond with all its structural disadvantages, how do we weigh or balance the value of having a more coordinated, effective, executive-driven local government against the danger of creating a permanent political machine that just puts in their friends and punishes enemies. Leadership studies should be engaged in tackling practical problems of all kinds, problems like that, at the local, national, and global scale. But it will be a more interesting and more relevant discipline to the extent that it moves the enormous challenges of our disadvantaged communities to the center of our teaching and research. Challenge in Richmond and probably also where you live, we need only look to our back door to find. Thank you.